This is RSL 97. The time in St. Lucia and the Eastern Caribbean is 8:35 p.m. Stay tuned for IPI with Shelton Daniel. And we now go over to Shelton Daniel and say bonsoir, Monsieur Daniel.
Bonsoir, Monsieur Lawrence Adonis. Good evening to you, and I want to say good evening and welcome back to Mike Willie. It was nice seeing him in the studio after so long not having him in the spots. I want to say thanks to everyone for tuning in to In the Public Interest, IPI, here on RSL 97 tonight with me, Shelton Daniel, your producer and host. I hope your day, as indeed your weekend before it, has been quite wonderful, that you're refreshed, that you're rested and relaxed. We really appreciate you're taking the time to share what is always a very busy evening, considering it is the first day of the week. Of course, the nation's entire attention, perhaps throughout today, has been riveted on the Prime Minister's very important and very groundbreaking address to the nation last night. I say groundbreaking because I don't think there's ever been a time in the past where an investigation of this kind has been undertaken into the goings-on inside our Royal St. Lucia, St. Lucia Police Force. I don't think the Royal is still part of the nomenclature, not even sure about that, but the St. Lucia Police Force, as it pertains to police killings, yes, we've had inquests, but they've always been controversial. Not saying that this report isn't going to be controversial, but for it to be the subject of a national address that is so wide-ranging and so far-reaching, I don't think we've ever had that before. It didn't go as far as a former Prime Minister once did, but that's not what we're talking about tonight. Because in all that has been happening with the police and the Prime Minister's address, yesterday was International Women's Day, and I suspect that it has been so overshadowed by other things that it got very little mention. So, let me say to all the ladies of St. Lucia, happy, albeit belated International Women's Day. I hope that your Sunday was a good one in the observance, and that it continues to be a Women's Day every day in terms of the good fortune that I hope will come to you. Of course, the happiness of women is the happiness of us all, because they are the wives, the sisters, the mothers, the daughters of every single one of us. What would the world be like without women? And we men, what would we like? Yeah, we men, what would we be like without women? Okay, so my appreciation to you all. It goes without saying, of course, the men are very important too. I'm just saying that the focus is on the ladies. Before I go into what I wanted to talk about, let me just say that, just a little bit of trivia just passing through, although I think it's important. From time to time, the local newspapers publish those lists of accounts that have been dormant. The dormant accounts that have been inactive for, I think, periods of up to 14 years. People who have money in the bank, they've neither made withdrawals or deposits. They've not done anything to their accounts. And there is a law that if the account remains unclaimed after 14 years of inactivity, then the banks have to pass on that money, then becomes the state's money, okay? So they pass it on to the government. It would be interesting to find out every year, and maybe if you're listening to me, I don't mind the competition picking up on this. How much on average does the government make every year from those unclaimed accounts in terms of how it enriches the public treasury? That would be very interesting. And can you imagine, we are talking about difficult times, economic recession, and there are actually people with money in the bank that they forget about it, that they don't care enough to go and check. And I understand that sometimes some of those sums can be quite substantial. I mean, I was talking to a lady some time ago who said she had something like $8,000 in the bank and she hadn't touched it. And next thing she knew, the money was gone. It was taken. When she went to check, the bank told her, well, the account had been inactive. I said, goodness me, I wish I could be in a position where I could have $8,000 sitting in a bank and I so don't need it that 14 years can pass and I never went to check on it, to the extent that a bank would, take it. Of course, I would wish they wouldn't take it. But I'm saying you really have to be well set and well relaxed where finances are concerned for you to have $8,000, $10,000, $15,000 in a bank and 14 years pass. You never even went to check to see how much the interest has accrued, so how much it has grown or anything of that kind. You just let it sit there to the extent that it got taken. But the thing is that the bank publishes those notices in the newspapers. Sometimes they run into several pages, sometimes a whole 4-page pullout of those dormant accounts. And I don't think they're under any legal obligation to send you a letter in the mail. Once they've published it in the newspapers, to the best of my knowledge, that is the requirement of the law. tough luck if you don't happen to read the newspapers, if you can't read so you don't see the notices. My bone of contention is that if you're going to publish a list that is hundreds of names long, I won't venture into hyperbole and say thousands, but let's say several hundreds of names. Already many people are challenged when it comes to reading. Already many of us have an aversion to reading. We don't read. Many of us can't read. For heaven's sake, why not just put it in alphabetical order so that I, Shelton Daniel, if I look at it, I can just go to the section that is under D, or if you don't want to put it surname first, you put first name first. So I can go to S and I can look and see, okay, Shelton is my name there, so I can hurry and say, okay, I've come to deposit $5 to my account today just to keep it active or whatever. They have the thing all jumbled up, no alphabetical order, no sequence. So in order to see if your name and your account are among those that are published as being inactive, you would virtually have to sit down and devote so much time. We are living in times where we have not so much a poverty of money. If you can have money sitting in a bank for 14 years and don't check on it, unless you're dead, of course, you're not that poor. The main poverty of our time is a poverty of time. To sit down and to expect me to peruse hundreds of names in fine print so that I can pick out my name. This isn't 1960, and I suspect way back then we already had sufficient capability where we could have put this in alphabetical order without too much difficulty. But that's just something that I wanted to mention. Okay, this is in the Public Interest IPI. Believe it or not, I have a guest in the studio with me, and I want to apologize and say thanks to her for being very patient with me. Didn't intend to have Hyacinth on the line for so long, but of course the chat with her just grew on me, and I think grew on her, and we went on. Very interesting. I'm sure many women listening would be inspired. The guest in the studio is here to talk on the subject matter of sex. Yes, sex. Many of us are afraid to talk about it, afraid even of the word. She's not, and she says we shouldn't be. So IPI tonight is going to be quite interesting. Did you ever believe that sex is a matter in the public interest? Well, let's see what she has to say when we come back from this break.
Gasa depuis c'est payer moi payer l'argent moi, il paye voler loi pas fait moi.
Ça c'est loi ou frère. Mais si vous voulez connaître loi pays, écoutez avocat Alfred Alcide à sous vision 7h30 pour 8h30 les mardis au soir. Ou ça téléphoner 452-3959 pour demander question à sous loi. Oui, c'est loi pays les mardis à sous vision.
Et garçon, radio moi sous RSL 97 on.
Do you want first-hand information on policy changes that may very well affect your daily life? Then tune into Inside Government every Tuesday from 2 p.m. on RSL 97. Hear accurate information from the decision makers themselves on the latest developments within government. Join Jada Jean-Pierre Emmanuel, Press Secretary to the Prime Minister, as she takes you Inside Government every Tuesday from 2 p.m. only on RSL 97.
Thank you so much, everyone, for staying within the Public Interest IPI on this 9th day of March 2015 with me, Shelton Daniel, your host and the producer, and Lawrence Adonis, the man at Master Control. Let me, without any further ado, say good evening and welcome to Barbara Lee. She is the author of a book called Sacred Sex, Replacing the Marriage Ethic with a Sexual Ethic. Barbara is someone who is a full-time speaker. She's a writer, yes, but she spends her time giving talks at different places around the world. She's been in St. Lucia giving interviews. And Barbara is also a minister of religion, an ordained interfaith minister is how she describes herself. But I'll let her tell us more about herself and her journey and what has brought her to this point of going all around the world telling people that they need not think of sex as a sin, but neither should you think of sex as a sport. It's not something that is forbidden, but it's not something that you should tinker and toy and play with or use to manipulate people. I'm saying too much already. Barbara, welcome to Radio St. Lucia and to IPI.
Thank you, Sheldon. It's wonderful to be here.
All right. And your book, Sacred Sex, although I have to say when I read it, coming from a fairly conservative Christian background myself, I found it to be quite liberated. And I do agree with you there. The different poles of all sex is sin. We shouldn't even mention it. And there's the other one where, if it feels good, just do it. Anything goes kind of culture. You are talking about finding the balance. But part of your balance is that we have to respect and accept and embrace embrace things like same-sex and homosexuality and transgender and so on, which may be a hard sell to many people. But again, I prefer to let you tell me your story.
Okay, well, I spent the last 25 years in nonprofit administration and in ministry. And it was in that work, working with people of all genders and sexual orientations, that I really found this common theme that we weren't having conversations about the intersection of sexuality and spirituality. And I started telling my story a little more. I was raised in a highly over-sexualized childhood, which included being sexually abused. And when that was discovered, it was met with absolute silence, which was pretty devastating. It led me to believe as I was growing up that nobody would be interested in me if they didn't have access to me sexually. But I was also raised with a very strict marriage ethic. And the marriage ethic is that if you're married, it's okay to have sex, and if you're not married, it's not.
You were disappointed on both counts, were you? First of all, the matter of your body by giving it to somebody that you'd really get them, and that the marriage would make all things, come to bliss for you. It appears that neither of them panned out the way you
No, neither of them did. I ended up in a physically abusive relationship, and once more I had sex, got married again, and was in an emotionally abusive relationship until I finally discovered that I could claim agency over my own body. And
was that the point at which you decided that marriage as we know it is not for you anymore?
I'm not anti-marriage, and I'm not anti-monogamy. I just don't believe that we should be tying marriage and sex together, because when we do that, a couple of things happen. The problem with the marriage ethic is that it doesn't have anything to say to our young people. We can tell our young people not to have sex, but they're having sex. STDs are growing, teen pregnancy is a reality. So we need to talk to our young people. Marriage ethics says nothing to divorced people, to widowed people, to anybody.
Disabled people, others that you mentioned in your book.
Single disabled
What
people.
about the person who's wheelchair bound and they probably can't engage in sex as we know it,
Right.
Or as we normally define it. Just let me read a few paragraphs, a couple of paragraphs from what I think is the first chapter of your book. It's not a very long book. It's just about 130 odd pages or thereabout. About a little less than 120. It says, I was dubbed the sex minister at a speaker's conference after explaining my mission to get people talking about sex. Nothing like talking two of the weightiest words that carry the most emotional baggage in the English language and combining them into one title. As we talk about the intersection of spirituality and sexuality, I believe it is important for you to know that I deeply honor my Christian roots, and I am humbled by the witness of the mystics. I also find that this deepening of my faith has led me to embrace the universal truths found in all wisdom traditions. While I do address in these pages some specific issues in the Christian community, it is not a Christocentric book. Whether you are Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, agnostic, atheist, align yourself with any of the other world traditions or not, I believe you will find the central message of this book resonating in the deepest part of your being. The feedback that you're getting from people who've read that book, do they agree with you? I mean, you come from the United States of America, which I think still by and large considers itself to be a Christian country. Mm-hmm. Of course, it's very pluralistic. America is the place where you can be whatever you want. You can be a Muslim, you can be a Hindu, you can be a Rastafarian, you can be whatever. What has been the kind of response to someone who was raised in a Christian family, who I think you were Orthodox Christian in the Lutheran tradition you mentioned in your book and so on, but now you've decided to take an interfaith approach. You're not only saying that, Islam, Judaism, all of them have equal validity, but you're also saying in the book that things like someone who decides that a partner of the same gender is right for them, that they have just as much validity as those who believe it is strictly heterosexual. I'm just asking, what kind of response has Barbara Lee been getting?
It's all over the map. So I have a lot of people who find liberation and freedom and joy in feeling loved and accepted, where they have been traditionally rejected and outcast. But there are many conservative areas in the United States, including West Michigan, where I live, where that is not a welcome message, where there are a lot of barriers to full inclusion in the church, and a lot of what I call spiritual violence, where we don't accept people as they are. And again, I think the biggest need is to have those conversations, that we have to talk about sex, that we can't just bury our head in the sand.
Do you find an unwillingness to speak about sex in traditional religion, aka in Christianity? Or is it a generalization that you're making perhaps because of one or two bad experiences, but there are in fact many people in Christianity, as in the other religions, pastors, the clergy, lay people who are quite willing, church counselors and so on, to talk fairly openly about sex? I mean, or is it that you think there is a lot of stigma associated with it, which is serving as an impediment to the kind of conversation that you obviously believe we should be having?
Yeah, again, there are differences throughout the world and throughout my country. So there are some places that are willing to have those conversations, but by and large, there's a lot of shame-based teaching, a lot of abstinence-only teaching, and a lack of genuine conversations, realistic conversations. When I share my story of abuse, I do that not to draw that attention to myself, but because every time I do, I have people approach me and tell me that that was their story too. And so I'm trying to do my part to create a culture in which we can start having those conversations and start healing those aspects of shame and start living healthy sexual lives.
Tell us about the aspects of shame. What does that shame arise from, do you think? You do mention in your book, for example, abuse is one of the main catalysts of that kind of shame. You mentioned the religious teachings that have caused people to have a view that this is evil and not even to have the feelings. You touch very frankly on subjects such as masturbation. What do you believe is the main cause of the shame that people harbor with regards to sex?
I think it is the passing down of teachings that are fear-based, that we've kind of internalized these ideas that sex is dangerous, that male sexuality is predatory and uncontrollable, that female sexuality is destructive and evil, and that it's the task of every civilized person to confine sex within very narrow limits. And then we teach, for instance, when I was growing up, the threat was either being labeled a prude on one hand or a slut on the other. And so again, we have this polarization. Sex is sin or sex is sport. Sex is something bad that we only do for procreative reasons, and we don't want to talk about the pleasure of sex. And or on the other hand, we trivialize it so that there's nothing special about it at all.
What is the happy middle ground that you believe should be taken in that regard? Don't trivialize it. Don't make it a sport. Don't make it something you use to toy with yourself or with others. Yet at the same time, don't make it something over which hangs this cloud of prohibition and forbiddenness and stigma. What is the happy middle ground you think that can be taken?
I think the happy middle ground is the creation of a sexual ethic, where we are very intentional and discerning about how we'll be sexual beings in the world. And I talk about the tenets of a sexual ethic. For instance, mutual consent, that there needs to be consent from both parties each and every time you have sex, even if you're in a committed relationship, even if you're married. Part of the problem with the marriage ethic is not only does it leave out people that aren't married, it also implicitly condones a whole host of abusive behaviors as long as they take place within marriage. And we have to divide that out again. Even if you're married, you need to have the right to say no, and without being punished or without facing coercion.
Does your being a woman give you greater impetus to carry on with this campaign and to spread out this message? Because there is a sense that in those matters of sex and in terms of the whole negotiation, women tend to be at a disadvantage in it all. They tend to be the ones who are set upon, and like you say, the men are regarded as the predators. Did you ever get that feeling as a woman growing up that you were put at a disadvantage?
Yeah, I think women bear the brunt of the shame-based teachings. The double standard, where we tend to kind of vilify women who are sexual, but expect that of our men, especially young men versus young women. We have this double standard around that behavior. And I think as a result, we have these very conflicted ideas about sex. And there are things we want to do, but we feel bad doing it. And so we need to move to that place of conversation and reconciliation, because not only do those shame-based teachings affect women negatively, they also end up creating mixed messages for men. So a woman is maybe saying no because she's supposed to say no, but she's feeling the desire for yes, and men don't know how to respond to that either. So it's about empowering both men and women to really take time to intentionally think about themselves, their own sexual needs, their sexual desires, their own moral and religious views and how those enter into how they are sexual beings, and then to decide, not in the heat of the moment, but with forethought, how they will be sexual beings, how they'll relate to another person sexually, how they will take responsibility for protecting themselves and their partner from being abused or manipulated or taken advantage of.
All right. Was it necessary for you to turn your back from Orthodox Christianity as you had been brought up in, so that you could have taken the stance that you took? Because it appears to me, for example, that you were saying something which would make any normal, conventional pastor or church cringe, that you were saying that sex can be okay outside of marriage. That's supposed to be a forbidden thing, where Christianity is supposed to be absolutely taboo. And you did say, yes, you believe sex outside of marriage can be perfectly healthy and holy. And you push the boundaries even further when you say that things such as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, you mentioned others, the queer, and all those sorts of things, that they can be perfectly legitimate. Do you still consider yourself a Christian, having held on to those views?
Yes, I do. And there is a growing number of people within the progressive Christian movement who still contend, my Jesus is a hero for me. And I follow the example and the teachings of Jesus, which has always been about love and inclusion. Whenever anybody drew a line and said somebody was out, Jesus stood with the people who were out. And so I live by that example. I was doing ministry with, as you mentioned, the Lutheran Church. I was doing a new mission church. And it was all about reaching out to marginalized people who didn't feel welcome, people who had been hurt, had been rejected by the traditional church, and creating a place where they did receive, nobody was outside of God's grace, that everybody was welcome at the table. As that community grew, it brought me face-to-face in relationships with people who were gay and lesbian and transgender. And I can't believe that God hates those people. God is
You even challenge the principle that you can love the sinner but hate the sin. You believe that is essentially a form of hypocrisy? I mean, tell us about how you differentiate.
Yeah, I believe that we are created good, and to label people as in their own being as inherently wrong, inherently sinful, inherently bad is, I think, a misreading of the message of Jesus Christ.
Tell us about the interfaith, how you become a pastor, or a minister, or however you call it, of that interfaith community. What really is interfaith that we're talking about here?
So I, again, as I was doing the ministry to marginalized people, that also brought me into touch with people who weren't part of the Christian church, and I started taking classes at Mother's Trust Interfaith Institute, and was eventually ordained an interfaith minister. I really, in my Christian path, have followed the trajectory of the Christian mystics, which I think we truncate the Christian tradition by not talking about the mysticism within our own lineage. And so when people get to that point where they're looking for the direct experience of God without necessarily needing an institution to be the intermediary, they don't believe they can find that in the church.
Okay.
And they move to Buddhism or to another faith rather than staying in their own tradition. I think there's much greater depth when we stay in our own tradition.
I think the biggest threat to our young people today is the trivialization of sex. From early on, our children are inundated with adult sexual content. It is in the movies they watch, the music they listen to, and the porn they watch. You go on to say, there are at least 3 problems with this here. You say further that today these experiences seem innocent compared to the graphic and often violent imagery of sex widely available today. There are at least 3 problems with this new reality. The first is the obvious fact that porn objectifies human beings and teaches our youth that such objectification is culturally acceptable and even normative. The second is that pornography does not create realistic expectations about sexual encounters. It creates false impressions of what people look like, what they actually enjoy, and how they respond. Finally, it removes any sense of the sex act being anything special, anything worth celebrating, and anything worth reserving for the appropriate time and place and person. I focused on this, Barbara, because I think we have for decades. It seems almost like it is the twin sister of the woman's liberation, the feminist movement, that the sexual liberation also seem to have taken place in parallel with it. A lot of what we're talking about there is being cast as a woman's sexual and reproductive rights, her right to express herself sexually, to be a sexual being. If it feels good, then do it. If you got it, flaunt it. You know, these sort of things that we're being told about all the time. Marketers now, it's almost standard and stock that they use women who are dressed in what you considered skimpy and bikinis to advertise cars, to advertise drinks, energy drinks. I mean, the whole sex sales thing seemed to use women as its mascot, as its emblem, as the poster, and all of that. Yet a lot of women will fiercely defend their right to do that, to do those things. How do you differ between what you're actually saying in the trivialization of sex, which has a lot to do with the imagery that we are bombarded with all the time, that is being sold as a woman's right, as a means of her expressing herself, but yet you're saying there's the whole trivialization of it. Now, I'm sorry I'm taking a little tone of women because I am talking to a woman. Yesterday was Women's Day, and I think sex and feminism and those things, it is almost impossible to separate them. And so when you speak about sex, we have to talk about gender issues with them. I hope I haven't said too much that I haven't lost you.
No, not at all. Not
Yes.
at all. And I was at the International Women's event yesterday
Okay.
and greatly appreciated that event. I think, I think it's a problem that we have normalized the objectification of human beings. And you're absolutely right, Shelton, about advertising, media, the depiction of sex and sexualized violence, particularly in our movies and our music. The average age of exposure to internet pornography now is 11 years old, moving down to 10 years
It's
old.
very scary, huh?
It is. It is. And at the same time, we're not equipping our kids with the tools to make those decisions. So again, to have the conversation about sex is absolutely critical. Our kids are growing up with these role models. My son, I have 2 boys. My youngest just turned 20, and when I told him about the risk of being called a slut when I was in high school, he told me, I don't know a single girl who's not a slut.
Wow.
Now, I don't even believe that, and I don't even think he does, but I do think that's the image that so many of our young ladies think they need to project.
But then when you look at what's being offered on the television, I mean, as a black man myself, you look at, what's this latest one on BET, Being Mary Jane, starring Gabriel Union, for example. I mean, there is that image of the sexually liberated, even promiscuous, yet at the same time, person in a prestigious premium career, right up there in the society and so on, but at the same time living a life of, I feel like going and doing some little whatever tryst on the side or fling between different men with a married man and so on, being juxtaposed with that image of the well-educated, successful person. And even you, I have to ask this, Barbara, when you in your book, and by the way, this isn't an attack on you, but you seem, I wouldn't say glorifying it, you go and say this, the first lesson is that sex is good and good sex is a gift. We are all sexual beings and our bodies, no matter the size, shape, age, or condition, are beautiful. Agreed. To believe that sex is dirty or sinful is like believing that we are dirty or sinful. I can take that. with that kind of foundation, we are almost certain to end up carrying shame for our own perfectly natural sexual desires and fulfillments. What exactly is natural? What exactly is something that is acceptable? Are there any things that can have to do with the human being perhaps being in a disordered state, something that may be aberrant that has to do, and I'll get to what I'm saying in a moment. But you go on to highlight, apart from the book, in the book, The Ethical Slut, a woman shares a story of discovering the joys of masturbation as a young girl in the back seat of the family car, tucked under a warm blanket on a long trip. It felt so wonderful that she concluded the existence of a clitoris was proof positive that God loved her. If we can say that these things are okay, why not? There may be many other girls who will not discover it in the backseat of their car, tucked under a warm blanket. They can only discover it when they see it shown in some porn flick or video or something of the other. If people can discover it by accident, why can't they discover it by demonstration? Why do you on the one hand decry pornography and what you think is the trivialization, but at the same time, you know, the kind of accidental discovery, you find it's okay? What's the difference between them?
Well, I think babies naturally explore their body, and children naturally explore their body. That's how we learn about our body. I think the problem we run into when we start moving into the sex trade is that we've normalized it so much that we actually have come to start believing that everybody is in the business by choice. Now, I'm not saying there aren't people in the business by choice, but there is also the reality of sex trafficking, which is growing and profoundly disturbing.
But isn't that normal fare for the human faculties, for the human animal, if I may use that phrase here, that anything which is intensely pleasurable, we always run the risk of misusing it, and misusing it in ways that we may not even realize the progression of misuse. Alcohol produces a pleasurable sense of relaxation. What do? We use alcohol for everything, to numb our pain. We use it to medicate things that we need to address in healthier ways. We misuse marijuana. We overuse, the whole drug thing becomes of people who discover some pleasure in cocaine, which may have medicinal uses, or heroin or whatever. Then it becomes a problem. Why doesn't that hold for sex? That it is something which is or is potentially quite pleasurable, and that people can actually go off, as we can say, totally unhinged, when it comes to sex.
And that's, again, why I'm an advocate for a sexual ethic, because it doesn't need to be one extreme or the other.
All right.
And I think part of the fear-based teaching is that it is. We think that if we say it's okay to have marriage outside of, to have sex outside of marriage, that somehow we're unleashing this uncontrolled sexual energy.
Okay.
There's a big disparity. There's a big gap between preaching sex is sin and shame, and saying do whatever you want, wherever you want. There's no repercussion. There's nobody.
So where do we get the standards and the principles by which we can set the boundaries of this sexual ethic if everyone has a different notion of what it is? Because let's face it, everybody, I will speak to 100 Babrelis, and they will all have a different notion. Somewhere in your book you reference something from the book of Judges. I found that very interesting, because the book of Judges itself does state about Israel in the days when there was yet no king, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And when it comes to sex and the boundaries of what is right and so on, you may have this view that some degree of sexual liberation is right, but venturing into pornography and trivialization is wrong. There are others who may say that what we call pornography and trivialization are just different, as we can say, extents of that liberation and so on. I'm just saying, is there one kind of uniform grounding that we can have in this sexual ethic, which, while you have posited it in your book, others who can be equally or even more persuasive may have a different idea of that sexual ethic?
For me, it comes
and yet
down,
the problems we face are all common. You know,
Right.
what you
They
highlighted,
are.
the disease and everything else is the same thing.
Exactly. And so what it comes down to for me is that I won't meet my needs at the expense of somebody else. And so that's where again, an ethic comes into play, that there has to be mutual consent, that there has to be responsibility for protecting myself and my partner from sexually transmitted disease and unplanned pregnancy, that there needs to be some form of relational intimacy, at least enough to talk to each other about what this sex act means.
Okay.
That we're on the right page, that we both agree whether this is a regular permanent commitment or whether it's not. If there is a commitment made, then we need to be true to that promise.
Okay.
And we need to be open and honest when we change in relationship to the commitment we're willing to make.
Okay. All right, you're listening to In the Public Interest IPI. Barbara Lee and I can talk till the program ends at 10 o'clock, but I want you to be part of the discussion. We'll take a break right now. When we come back, we'll be opening the telephone lines to take your calls. Bear in mind, the number is 4523959. You can send us emails as well. Send them to me in this case, sdaniel@rslonline.com. All right, so sdaniel@rslonline.com. Any questions you want to ask Barbara Lee or any comments that you want to make, but we'll do that after this commercial break.
Eh bien, plaisir à sous RSL 97, tous les samedis au soir à 8h. Là où Gaëtan compas en toute façon.
Compas ancien, compas nouveau et compas pour toutes les fanatiques. Ou aussi qu'à une information à sous le musicien compas.
Et pour qu'à jouer un cadeau aussi pour participation. Alors, fini par ce temps tous les samedis au soir et puis compas non-stop.
Plaisir plein pour toute maman et compas. Ici, c'est ici. Et ça, notre pays aussi.
Sundays at 1 p.m.
I start from the proposition that the two main objectives of any state are first, the pursuit of proper arrangements for economic development, where that term would include the social development requirements, and secondly, the pursuit of meaningful arrangements for the maintenance of the state in both its domestic and external dimensions, its internal and external security.
Every week, RSL 97 brings a major issue into the lecture hall.
The revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, sometimes called the RTC, is the foundation text of community law for the Caribbean community.
Come into the lecture hall this Sunday from 1 p.m. on RSL 97.
Gasa depuis c'est payer moi payer l'argent moi, il paye c'est voler loi pas fait moi.
Ça c'est loi ou frère. Mais si vous voulez connaître loi pays, écoutez avocat Alfred Alcide sous Vision 7h30 pour 8h30 les mardis au soir. Ou ça téléphoner 452-3959 pour demander une question à sous loi. Oui, c'est loi pays les mardis à sous Vision.
Et garçon, radio moi sous RSL 97 on.
Do you want first-hand information on policy changes that may very well affect your daily life? Then tune into Inside Government every Tuesday from 2 p.m. on RSL 97. Hear accurate information from the decision-makers themselves on the latest developments within government. Join Jada Jean-Pierre Emmanuel, Press Secretary to the Prime Minister, as she takes you Inside Government every Tuesday from 2 p.m. only on RSL 97.
Thank you so much, everyone. Do we have a call on the line? All right, Lawrence Adonis says not yet. We're open to taking your calls, 4523959. We have our first caller. You're on the air. Hello.
Hello, good evening, Shelton.
Hi, good evening to you.
Yes?
Yes, good evening to you.
Yes, I have a question for your guest, if you don't mind.
Yes.
You said you follow the teachings of Jesus Christ, which is found in the scripture. But the scripture clearly says who will and who will not enter the kingdom. And if that is specified as to fornicators and adulterers and effeminates and abusers of themselves and so forth and so on, how do you override this and say that this is what you're saying is a teaching of Christ?
Well, again,
Go ahead.
as I talked earlier, I believe when I look at the words of Jesus, the words that are attributed to Jesus, that those are always words of welcome and love and grace.
You're absolutely right. But he also said, if you love me, keep my commandments and keep the commandments of my Father.
And he said the greatest commandment is to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself.
Yes, But there are other things he said. You can't be a murderer to enter the kingdom. You can be a fornicator. You can be an adulterer. You can be an effeminate, an abuser of yourself. You're not going to enter the kingdom. Neither drunkards, revelers, extortioners. It clearly states who is going to enter the kingdom and who he is going to punish and refuse to enter the kingdom.
And I truly respect your...
It's not my view. It's what the Bible says.
And I will say that I'm not a biblical literalist. The Lutheran Church that I was raised in is not a literalist tradition. So we will have differences in interpretation and opinion. And but I deeply respect yours.
But when the Bible says who and who is not going to enter, it's not an interpretation.
And Jesus also says, my Father has sheep of another flock that you don't know. So I'm not going to be the one to make that judgment.
Obey. We're always talking about keep his commandments. If you don't mind, I stressing on that.
Okay. And I know Jesus also says, do not judge, lest ye be judged. And so...
I'm not judging anybody. I'm reading from the Bible.
All right, Alex, she obviously doesn't see it. I'm sorry for calling out your name. Sorry about that.
Okay, no, it's okay, because I just wanted to make... she's bringing out information to support what she believes. I have no problem with that, but I would like to inform my people also of what is written in the scripture. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. St. Lucian, who is calling you from New York, by the way, and a very religious person. And, we continue taking your calls, 4523959. Yes, you're on the air.
Good evening. How are you, my brother?
I'm doing okay. How about you?
My sister?
Hello. Good evening.
I'm fine. The question, I'd like to make a comment. Some of them are so foolish, right?
Speak slowly, and remember we're talking to an American. She may not understand your, so try to speak a little slower for her.
Some of the young ladies are so foolish. Before song play, they could hear one girl, they could hear song like that, they were in already. Before they did song, they gyrate already. And most of the things in the media, they have to have a young lady gyrating or have a string panty or something on them. That's my comment. Good night.
All right. I think he's talking about the way about women either sexually exploited or exploit themselves, that anything that you have to see women, moving themselves in sexually suggestive ways and so on. And what are your thoughts on that? But I think we touched on that already. Using women in very sexualized ways, as tools for advertising and marketing and so on.
Yeah, anything that objectifies other human beings, I don't think is healthy.
Okay. 4523959 is the number to dial. Your emails to sdaniel@rslonline.com. My guest in the studio tonight is American Barbara Lee. She is author of the book Sacred Sex. And I can tell you she's got two websites that you can go to. One is called thesexminister.com. And the other one is called Barbara Lee Author, AUTHOR.com, where you can read more concerning what she's about, what she speaks on, what she's written about, and what she believes, okay? Barbara,
yes.
On the subject of homosexuality, which you probably know in the Caribbean is largely taboo,
yes.
It is said to be a region that is greatly homophobic. It is a region where many people are actually quite repulsed by homosexuality. The question that I want to ask is, on the one hand, you speak about abuse and the sense of shame that it can cause. Many times, I want to put it to you that gay people feel discriminated against because they are carrying their own shame. A lot of people who are celebrating their homosexuality, it's simply a case where they have made peace to something to which they were traumatically introduced. That there are very few people who become homosexual just as a matter of choice, that I make an adult and deliberate choice. They were probably molested by somebody, sometimes even at an age before they could remember it. It programmed them in a way so they have developed certain reflexes in that regard, but it is something that is unremembered. It is something that is unacknowledged, as indeed not just with homosexuals. The young girl who grows up being a prostitute, being promiscuous, probably never remembers that some uncle of hers may have been, tampering with her and messing about with her, but the reflexes are triggered and so on. I'm just saying, why would we want to make peace or to say it's all right for something whose very existence is the result of an evil perpetrated against a person? Or do I have it wrong on that one? Feel free to tell me.
I do believe that sometimes those kind of behaviors can result, that kind of abuse can result in those kind of life choices later on. But I also know a great number of people, good friends of mine, who say that all of their life, without any kind of abuse or any negative experience, just always knew themselves to be out of step with society, to be attracted to same sex, to not have songs that they could relate to not have role models that they could turn to, and that they can look at their entire childhood and not have those experiences. So I do believe that there are people who are just born homosexual, and that there have been throughout the ages.
Okay. We are taking your calls. Lawrence Adonis, I know you're watching out for those calls. The number to dial is 4523959. Any questions you want to ask of Barbara Lee, the author of the book Sacred Sex, Replacing the Marriage Ethic with a Sexual Ethic. She's in the studio with us right now. And you can also send emails to me, sdaniel@rslonline.com. All right. Here's something else reading through your book I had to ask myself. Would it be fair to say that you seem to have been someone who's heavily influenced by what... Okay, we have a call on the line. Hi, good evening. You're on the air.
Hello?
Hi, you're on the air, yes.
Yes, good evening. I was just making a comment. I'm just taking a chance, really. I know that I'm Christian also, and I know that a lot of Christians will call and say that it's wrong to have sex outside of marriage. But in reality, even Christians do that. And I think, and I believe in my heart, that if people who are not married have lived a life together and have been faithful to each other, I think in the eyes of God, and certainly in the eyes of a Muslim, they are married, because marriage takes place when you have sex with that person. That's when the marriage actually takes place. And if that's the case and they have lived faithfully, I don't think God is going to say to them, depart from me, you never got married. Because I believe that in the eyes of God they were married. When Jacob got his wife, he saw her, he looked at her, he loved her, he took her into his tent, and he went in down to her, and she became his wife. Okay? So I think if two people are faithful to each other through their lifetime, I don't think that it's not Christian according to us, but I think that God is not going to condemn them for that. God is going to look at them for what he calls unbelief and lack of other things. But I would say that adultery and fornication, which is carried out by both Christians and non-Christians alike, is a much heavier and weightier matter in my eyes. That was just something I thought I should say.
If you can stay on the line, let me just read a couple paragraphs from a chapter in Barbara's book for you, if you can just stay there. It says the human animal can direct their sexual energy wherever they want. Some choose to use this energy in life-giving, celebrating, and enriching ways. Some choose to use this energy in abusive and negative ways. Others waste it and disperse it indiscriminately. There are many ways in which we can express sexual energy, both positively and negatively. But here's the part that I really want to focus on. Sex between people who do not love one another and are not willing to become uniquely responsible to and for one another assumes a split between body and spirit that does not exist. When I read this, I wrote in the margin of it, isn't that what the commitment of marriage is all about? A public ceremony or ceremony at which there are witnesses, which causes people to testify that they are committing to each other. It's not saying that they are doing it for sex or that they must have sex, but that they are pairing with each other, taking responsibility for each other. So isn't such a commitment necessary to prevent the kind of heartache that comes with just, willy-nilly sex all over the place, or do you think it can be done without it?
Well, no, I think for me, in the confines of marriage, it's fine. Mm-hmm. But what I'm saying is that she has all the ingredients there. It's not something, we're not animals, but sex has been reduced to just an activity.
Okay.
Which is so disgusting now that it means nothing. I mean, men take women out to a dance, they buy them a Coke or a rum. That results in, I bought you a drink, so therefore you have to sleep with me. And that is what happens on an average daily basis. Women want a pair of shoes, women want something, they go to a dance, they get their shoes, they get their drink, they get their food or whatever it is they need for the night. So in sex nowadays, there's no love. And love and sex are two different, completely things. Completely different. People get married to spend a life together, to share and to grow together, right? And sex is a part of it. It's only a part of it.
So why do you think there seems to be that hard wiring between the sexes of women using sex as a means to get what they need, to have their needs met, and men using sex as a means to express power and dominance and so on?
Because people have allowed themselves to be misled and to be misused, as you may have said earlier, because I was at a meeting, I missed the great part of this thing. I just tuned in at 1:30 when you opened the lines, because I was at a meeting, I couldn't, avoid it. But what I'm saying is people don't know who they are and whose they are, so they can live just precariously. And just by men especially doing what they want and having power over women. And women release themselves and subject themselves to this kind of lifestyle. But there are people who will say, well, how else can we eat? How else can we feed our children? And all of us know very well what happens when a woman has a child. She has to have a relationship with somebody else and somebody else and somebody else to feed that one and feed that one, and endlessly picking up children along the way. Each one trying to feed the one from the child before.
Okay.
The father doesn't even know or doesn't even admit that he's a father. And if he gives $5, it's for that particular child and not for any of the other two you have or the other three or the 4 or 5 that you have. Sex has become just an activity like washing your hands or taking a drink. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Okay.
And it is a gift, and it's a gift of God which was given to us not just for procreation but for enjoyment.
Okay. Thank you very much, caller. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Any responses to that call from you, Barbara?
I think that she's absolutely on the mark, that we have kind of reduced sex to this trivial thing that we've been talking about. And the other thing I wanted to mention in terms of the marriage is it is traditionally based on a property model. It was a contract model. And so the idea was you bought your wife with, you gave a dowry and you earned this property. So men could control their women, and women could use sex to get financial security and raise their kids. And that's a legacy that we're continuing to live with, but as mature people in a new age should be able to think beyond.
Now that you've mentioned new age, you've used the words new age. As I read the book, I mused to myself that this seems to be someone who's heavily influenced by the new age teachings, by the tantric teachings about sex and the exchange of sexual energy, and the yogi's view of our connection to the cosmos and the cosmic effects of sex and the whole spiritualizing of sex and so on. Are you somebody who considers yourself very plugged into what we commonly refer to as the new age?
No,
Eastern mysticism and all that? Yeah.
I actually think that I am more tied into ancient spirituality, both through Christian mysticism and also through Taoism. And I have spent time and led pilgrimages in China around Taoism. I think, the legacy in the Christian church comes primarily from St. Augustine, and I talk about that in the book, who was credited with the idea of original sin and who believed that original sin was sex. That's quite a teaching to be passing down generation to generation.
All right. Barbara, we have just about 2 more minutes, and I think I really should give them to you. Oh, we have a caller. Hi, you're on the air. Hi, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Why do people have sex with animals? That's my question for now.
You have any thoughts on that, Barbara?
Why? I think that is a psychological issue. I don't think that's a normal activity. To have kind of species sex is not, I think, a normal activity, and I would not condone. I would not condone that. It's not ethical sex. You're talking about a situation in which one of the participants has no say, and I think that's abusive.
Okay, so I was saying that the last minute or so, do we have a caller, another caller on the line, Adonis?
Yes.
Hi,
good evening.
you're on the air.
Yes, thank you. I just want to expand a little on the previous caller, the lady who called, about the way we live here in St. Lucia and the way young men and women carry themselves. First of all, let me ask, does Barbara live on St. Lucia or she's there visiting?
I'm here visiting.
She's visiting.
How long have you been here?
This time I've just been here a little over a week.
Okay. Has anybody taken you around St. Lucia, especially on a Friday night, to see the behavior of the young men and women and the way they conduct themselves and the vulgarish way they dress?
I have not seen the activity on Friday night. I've been told something about it from my host, but I've not.
You should see it firsthand for yourself.
Okay.
And then you'll have a good understanding of what goes on in to the extent of the larger Caribbean, more so here in St. Lucia.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be an eye-opener for you. The other thing, too, is sex. Everybody's talking about sex. The previous caller did mention the fact that there's no love anymore. Where's the love? Everybody is sex and the four-letter word. Nobody loves, there's no love. The other thing I want to say is with the homosexual part. You are a pastor yourself. How come, and I have never heard any preacher mention the fact that in the book of Leviticus, it tells us how to behave ourselves with this whole homosexual thing and stuff like that. So you can't tell me, I find it hard to believe that people are born homosexual. I think it's a lifestyle that they choose. Because clearly, maybe not for the non-Christians.
Or one that they were abused into, molested into.
Exactly. But go into the book of Leviticus, and if Barbara knows the Bible, she knows Scripture, she will know that is morally wrong, and it's against the laws of God, that a man should lay with a man as he does with a woman and vice versa.
But the Levitical...
Nobody speaks about that. But I would, before you go, Barbara, before you leave the island, let somebody take you around and see for yourself first.
That'll have to wait for her next time in St. Lucia. She actually stayed a little longer than she did just so she could be on IPI tonight.
Oh, okay.
All right, she was due.
Maybe and then she'll get a clearer picture as to what goes on here on this island.
Okay. Thank you very much, caller. Barbara, are you about? But this is another thing I wanted to talk about: the homosexual paradox. You know, it has been found that a lot of homosexual people, they basically don't know how to get out of a reflex that was injected into them by some experience that was forced upon them when they were not in a situation. It's like a lot of young boys getting molested by priests whose parents were conscientiously sending them to church to be acolytes, thinking that they were putting them within the province of holiness and things that would be good for them, not realizing that the man of the cloth who was supposed to be sanctifying their sons and helping them to become more upright was actually doing some very corrupt things to them. And so they grow up with that sense of shame until they reach a point in their life where they're tired of the shame, they're tired of the feeling of worthlessness, so they make peace with the homosexual impulses that I say have been triggered in them by those experiences, while at the same time feeling very angry at themselves, at whoever it is, for the way they were introduced to it. And so they are living a paradox, even though they just generally make peace with it and they get into the homosexual lifestyle. How can we say that this is normal and that it is right, when the very basis upon which the person found themselves in that path was illegal, it was evil, it was wrong, and so on? Should we not be continuing the message that this is wrong, that this is something you need to turn away from, you need to find counseling, you need to do whatever, as opposed to saying that it's okay and it needs to be embraced?
I think abuse is wrong, and we do, statistically 1 in 3 women will be sexually abused sometime in their lifetime. 1 in 6 men will be sexually abused. Those are astronomical numbers, and abuse, as I'm sure you know, usually takes place by a family member or a friend.
And a lot of the time the abuser is someone who has been abused himself or herself, right?
Absolutely.
So it just gets getting repeated down the line, right?
Absolutely. But there's more proclivity that shows that abuse is going to be repeated than the person who's been abused will end up turning to same-sex relationships. That correlation has not been definitively proved.
Okay.
I'm not saying that never happens, but it's not a correlate. And so we have to look at that separate. Now, one of the things I did not unpack in my book are the 7 verses that are most often used to say that homosexuality is a sin. The previous caller talked about the book in Leviticus. The Levitical code was all about how the Jewish people were separating themselves from other people, and the code included things like not wearing 2 kinds of fabrics. And the scriptures need to be read in context and not conveniently cherry-picked for those things that prove or disprove our point. And that's where my grounding is in reading everything through the lens of Jesus. But there are books, and that's why I didn't include it in my book, that unpack all of those 7 scriptures and put them in the context that they were written. And in doing that, between that study that I've done, that reading that I've done, and then the relationships that I've developed with people who are gay and lesbian and transgender, is what has led me over time to come to a different understanding, my own different understanding about homosexuality.
Okay. Barbara Lee, we've gone over the time. I want to thank you so much for being my guest on In the Public Interest tonight, and in fact for staying a day longer in St. Lucia than you had intended. You were due to leave St. Lucia this morning, I think, Monday morning, but you decided to reschedule your flight to Tuesday so you could have been on IPI. I'm deeply appreciative of that, even though I guess myself and many others may not agree with everything that you've said, but I do believe that your insights are valuable nonetheless. Any parting words from you?
I want to thank you, first of all, for having me here. And I think the important thing isn't whether people agree with me or not, but that people start having the conversation. And whether they agree or they want to dismiss everything I've said, if people are talking about this tonight and tomorrow and the next day, then I have accomplished more than I could have hoped, and I've done that through your assistance. So thank you so much, Shelton.
All right, and I just want to tell everyone that tomorrow morning on 90 Minutes at 8:30, of course, I'll be having St. Lucia's ambassador to Petro-Caribe and Alba, that is Mr. Hippolyte Eustace Vitalis. He'll be the guest on 90 Minutes tomorrow morning. I think this will be a very interesting program, especially in light of the news that came out, I think, today, that the United States has declared Venezuela a threat to its national security. Was that a question that maybe Ambassador Vitalis might want to answer? How would that bode for the future of the Petro-Caribe and the Alba initiatives, given the pressure that the Maduro government has been under? Maybe not. Perhaps we can talk about the benefits that we've gotten from it and other matters, but that'll be left to him to decide the areas in which he is prepared to venture. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And from all of us here at RSL 97, Lawrence Adonis, who did another great job at Master Control, Shelton Daniel saying good night.